Hello everybody. As part of our focus on insider threats and human factors, today I'll be presenting a case study on the Uber data breach of 2016. It's often thought that insider threats are exclusively associated with malicious intent. However, as I'll hopefully demonstrate today, such threats can occur from simple human error coupled with poor controls. I'll be covering the details of the breach itself, how it arose, why it arose, and then move on to covering the impact, and finally we'll cover some strategies that could be employed to mitigate against such breaches. So in 2016, Uber experienced a breach affecting approximately 57 million riders and drivers, customers of Uber. This included the exposure of some 600,000 individual US driving license numbers, which constitutes PII, personally identifiable information, so sensitive customer data. This sensitive personal data was obtained from Uber's cloud storage environment hosted with AWS. As we'll see shortly, this breach occurred from an accidental action by an employee, making this a non-malicious insider threat. So what happened? Well, attackers were able to access Uber's cloud-hosted data and download large quantities of rider and driver information. This data was held in S3 buckets hosted in AWS, although we should note that AWS was in no way party to this breach. The compromised data included names, email addresses, phone numbers, and driving license details. Now, as part of their initial response, this is what makes this case study interesting, is Uber initially paid the attackers $100,000. Now, it was portrayed initially as payment as part of its bug bounty program. So the attackers purported to have discovered a bug, Uber paid them some money. What actually transpired was the attackers attempted to extort Uber, demanding a sum of money. Uber negotiated, paid the sum of $100,000, and made the attackers sign a non-disclosure agreement. All of this was in an attempt to prevent public disclosure. So ultimately, this breach was publicly disclosed, but it wasn't publicly disclosed until 2017. The way Uber handled the response led to significant regulatory scrutiny and criticism, and ultimately caused quite a bit of reputational damage due to the sensitivity of the data that it lost. Plus the fact trying to cover up the incident in the first place doesn't make them necessarily look particularly good. So how it happened. The breach occurred after AWS API access keys were committed to a private GitHub repository by an authorized Uber employee. So this is the human error by an insider that was ultimately the cause of the breach. Now, although this repository was private, attackers gained access to it and found the exposed credentials. Now, it's not completely clear to this day how attackers actually gained access to this repository, but they did. And scanning such repositories for exposed credentials is quite a common attack vector. Once they'd obtained them, these credentials enabled them programmatic access to the AWS environment and ultimately allowed them to exfiltrate large quantities of data. This slide moves on to why the breach was possible and the risk factors that contributed to it being such a significant breach. Now, whilst the insider action was the trigger for this breach, it wasn't alone the cause of the scale of the breach. The scale was because of several underlying risk factors, and we'll cover these risk factors now. From a credential management perspective, static cloud credentials were stored in source control. There was no automated secret scanning in place to detect such exposure. Now, typically what one would do is put a scanner such as Git leaks in place. This would monitor the push to the repository and reject any commits that potentially contain sensitive keys, passwords, and other sensitive data. What exacerbated this was the credentials were also long-lived and weren't rotated. So this actually increased the exposure window further. Had the keys been rotated, then they would have potentially not been useful to the attackers. So from an access control perspective, it seems that because they managed to exfiltrate large quantities of data, that sensitive data was stored together with no segmentation between it. So they were ultimately able to gain access to it all. And also those credentials appear to be quite broad in scope, such as they were able to download different types of data, that being customer and driver information. So normally you would segment that, and the IAM privileges granted to those credentials would limit the extent to which they could access that data. So from a governance perspective, there seems to be little monitoring in the repository, as mentioned earlier, and the delay in the public disclosure and their handling of the breach was wholly insufficient. Now, if we quickly look at the mapping of this breach to the CIA triad, where we discuss confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we can see primarily this represents a significant confidentiality failure. Large volumes of personal data were exposed. There's no real clear evidence that that data was tampered with in any way, and there wouldn't be any reason for the attackers to do so, and Uber's services weren't impacted, so there is no to minimal impact on either integrity or availability. Now we can move on to identifying the threats associated with what happens when large quantities of personal data such as this are exfiltrated together with the exposure of those credentials. So they fall into two broad categories: the threat to the organisation, i.e. Uber, and the threat to the individuals who have had their data compromised. Now, in terms of organisational threat, obviously those credentials allowed the attackers to obtain large quantities of data in the first place. It's not been proven, and there's no evidence that they did, but those credentials could enable attackers to move laterally, potentially gaining them access to other systems. And then, of course, there is the obvious threat to the reputation of the organisation, and the threat of regulatory involvement and potential fines. The second, and I'd argue more important, threat is to the individuals themselves. They could now be exposed to various attacking and social engineering attempts, such as phishing, more targeted spear phishing campaigns. They could be subject to identity theft, and they may even find their Uber accounts subject to fraudulent activity. Now, we looked earlier at how we can assess risk to the organisation, and we have an algorithm. So risk can broadly be defined as the likelihood of that threat occurring multiplied by the impact of that threat should it occur. We can then subtract the impact of any control measures in place to prevent or mitigate it. So in the case of this Uber data breach, we can assess the likelihood of such an attack would be high. As I mentioned previously, using exposed credentials in repositories is a fairly common attack vector. Now, because of the quantity of records obtained and the sensitivity of those records, we can say that the impact is also high. We've got a large number of users affected. There's the damage to the reputation of the organisation, and there's the damage due to any regulatory consequences. If we multiply those two together, high likelihood, high impact, we coupled with, as mentioned earlier, relatively poor controls, we can see that the overall risk assessment for this would be critical. Now we'll move on to some ways in which we could have prevented this from occurring in the first place. As we've learned previously, these can be broadly categorised into three areas. We've got people, we have processes, and we have technical solutions, and all three of them would come together to form a layered defence against such breaches. Now, from a people perspective, obviously, enhanced developer training. Developers need to be trained on secure coding practices, adherence to processes and procedures, and the ability to spot when they're actually doing something wrong. From a process perspective, it should be encouraged to introduce a mandatory peer review process. So every pull request has another pair of eyes, so they can potentially spot anything like this occurring. And again, processes introducing secure coding standards across the organisation. Finally, from a technical perspective, hopefully the other two would have prevented it occurring in the first place, but technically we could add secret scanning tools such as Git leaks, as I mentioned previously, on CI/CD pipelines or for manual commits. Those should detect any exposed credentials. We could limit the scope of any IAM roles within AWS such that they can only access limited amounts of data. That limits the blast radius. And again, we're enacting the principle of least privilege there. So those credentials can only see the data that they need to see. And finally, we can make sure that those credentials are rotated regularly, or not even used in the first place. We'd have credentials limited for a very, very short lifespan, just for the life cycle of those requests, and then they become useless. So finally, to conclude, this case, it demonstrates that insider threats are not always malicious actions by disgruntled employees. We could see that human error combined with insufficient controls and processes created an opportunity for attackers to instigate that breach. Key lesson here is that strong governance, layered security controls, and monitoring are essential where sensitive data is stored and manipulated. Ultimately, these controls are all about reducing the impact of the human errors and mistakes, which are ultimately inevitable. Finally, some references there where I got my information from. Feel free to have a little peruse of those. They're quite interesting. And thank you very much for taking the time to watch my presentation today.